Berlin, 1914. To understand the cataclysm that was to follow, one must first understand the world that preceded it. The dawn of the 20th century did not belong to the individual, it belonged to the state. It was an era defined by the age of empires, a period where the map of the world was a patchwork of vast, sprawling territories, held together by the iron will of monarchies and the prestige of crowns. Across the European continent, the geopolitical landscape was dominated by a handful of great powers, each operating under the belief that their destiny was tied to their expansion. In the West, the British Empire stood as the undisputed master of the seas, a global hegemon whose reach extended from the shores of Canada to the bustling ports of India and the sun-drenched coasts of Africa. For the British, stability was synonymous with the status quo, a world governed by maritime supremacy and a delicate balance of power. But the landscape was shifting. To the east, a new, hungry giant had emerged. The German Empire, unified only decades earlier, was a powerhouse of industry and scientific advancement. Under the ambitious guidance of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany sought its place in the sun. This was not merely a desire for prestige. It was a drive for Weltpolitik, world politics. Germany's rapid industrialization and its burgeoning navy began to rattle the established order, creating a profound sense of insecurity in London and Paris. To the south and east, the old guard was beginning to fracture. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling, multi-ethnic mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Slavs, and Italians, was a relic of a bygone era. It was a house of cards, held together by a complex bureaucracy and a desperate military tradition, constantly threatened by the rising tide of nationalism within its own borders. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, once the formidable sick man of Europe, was in a state of agonizing decline, losing its grip on its vast territories in the Balkans and the Middle East, leaving a power vacuum that every other empire was eager to fill. This was a world of grand illusions. The ruling elites of Europe lived in an age of unprecedented progress. They saw the steam engine, the telegraph, and the automobile not just as tools, but as proof of their civilization's inevitable ascendancy. There was a pervasive, almost intoxicating sense of optimism, a belief that the complexity of modern life could be managed through diplomacy, and that the sheer might of their respective empires rendered the concept of a total, continental war unthinkable. Yet beneath this veneer of gilded stability, the foundations were rotting. The competition for colonies in Africa and Asia, the relentless pursuit of industrial dominance, and the mounting tension between old dynasties and new national identities had turned Europe into a pressure cooker. The empires were no longer merely competing, they were colliding. They had built a global system so interconnected, so heavily armed, and so deeply entrenched in the pursuit of dominance that they had inadvertently created a machine designed for destruction. The age of empires had reached its zenith, but in its very grandeur, it had laid the groundwork for its own spectacular and violent collapse. London, 1914. If the age of empires provided the fuel for the coming conflagration, then the alliance system was the mechanism that ensured the spark would ignite the entire continent. For decades, the great powers had operated under a singular, driving obsession, the balance of power. The logic was deceptively simple. If no single nation became dominant enough to dictate terms to the rest, peace would prevail. But in the pursuit of this security, diplomats had woven a web of treaties so intricate and so secretive that they transformed Europe into a giant, interconnected trap. Instead of acting as a deterrent to war, these alliances functioned as a tripwire. By the turn of the century, the continent had effectively split into two armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Entente. This was a marriage of convenience between unlikely partners. France and Russia, traditional rivals, were bound by a mutual fear of German expansion, and Great Britain, the master of the seas, was drawn into their orbit to maintain the equilibrium of the continent. They were the guardians of the old order, a coalition designed to contain the rising tide of German ambition. Opposing them was the Triple Alliance, the Central Powers. At its heart was the dual alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. This was a partnership born of necessity. Germany needed a powerful ally in Central Europe to avoid the nightmare of encirclement, while the decaying Austro-Hungarian Empire needed German muscle to hold its fracturing borders together. But there was a profound danger in these pacts: the loss of agency. In the halls of Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg, the decision to go to war was no longer solely in the hands of a single monarch or a single parliament. The treaties were often written with blank checks and unconditional obligations. They meant that a localized dispute in a remote corner of the Balkans could no longer be contained by diplomacy. Because of the way these strings were tied, a conflict between two minor players would, by mathematical necessity, drag the giants into the fray. What made this system truly lethal was its secrecy. While the public spoke of peace and progress, the real decisions were made in shadows. Military staffs drafted mobilization plans that were predicated on the assumption that their allies would strike simultaneously. These were not merely political agreements. They were rigid mathematical timetables. To mobilize was, in many ways, to declare war. There was no room for hesitation, no space for the slow, deliberate work of de-escalation. As the gears of these alliances began to turn, the individual intentions of leaders became secondary to the structural demands of the system. A statesman might desire peace, but his treaty demanded movement. A general might seek a limited conflict, but his alliance demanded total commitment. The European powers had built a sophisticated security architecture intended to prevent a great war. Instead, they had constructed a massive, automated engine of escalation. They had created a world where every nation was a hostage to its neighbor's security, and where the slightest tremor in the Balkan powder keg would inevitably trigger a chain reaction that no diplomat could stop. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and the web was tightened, waiting for the first thread to snap. Berlin, 1900. If the alliance system provided the mechanical trap, then imperialism and militarism provided the raw, unbridled energy that fueled the engine. By the dawn of the 20th century, the great powers were no longer content with merely maintaining a balance of power. They were obsessed with the expansion of it. This was the age of new imperialism, a period defined by a relentless global scramble for dominance. The map of the world was being aggressively recolored by European ink. From the sun-scorched territories of Africa to the vast reaches of Asia, the great powers viewed the world not as a collection of sovereign peoples, but as a vast chessboard of resources, markets, and strategic outposts. This was a competition driven by the fever of nationalism and the cold logic of industrial capitalism. To be a great power was to possess colonies. To lack them was to face inevitable decline. The scramble for Africa had become a blueprint for global friction. Britain, France, and Germany found themselves locked in a zero-sum game where one nation's gain was perceived as another's existential loss. This colonial rivalry spilled out of the jungle and the desert and back into the halls of European diplomacy. Every new railway line in Morocco or every trade concession in China became a potential flashpoint. The world had become too small for the competing ambitions of these empires, and the friction caused by this global reach began to heat the very air in Europe. But imperialism was only half of the equation. As these empires expanded, they did so under the shadow of an unprecedented arms race. This was the era of militarism, the belief that a nation's greatness was measured by the size of its standing army and the caliber of its artillery. The cult of the military began to permeate every level of society. Generals were no longer just advisors to monarchs. They were the architects of national destiny. Nowhere was this more evident than in the naval race between Great Britain and Germany. For centuries, the British Royal Navy had been the undisputed master of the oceans, the guarantor of global trade and imperial security. But the rise of Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany brought a direct challenge to this hegemony. Through the construction of massive, steel-clad dreadnought battleships, Germany signaled its intent to challenge British supremacy. This was not merely a contest of engineering, it was a psychological war. To the British, the German Navy was a direct threat to their very survival. To the Germans, it was the necessary tool to demand their place in the sun. This spiraling competition created a dangerous feedback loop. As nations grew more imperialistic, they required larger militaries to protect their distant holdings. As their militaries grew, they required more resources, which in turn drove further imperial expansion. This cycle birthed a terrifying momentum. Military planners began to draft increasingly complex and aggressive mobilization schedules, predicated on the idea that the first nation to strike would hold the decisive advantage. By 1914, the continent was no longer just a collection of competing states. It was an armed camp. The industrial capacity of Europe had been diverted away from civilian progress and toward the mass production of death. The societies themselves had been conditioned to view war not as a catastrophe to be avoided, but as a glorious instrument of national will. The tools of destruction were polished, the soldiers were trained, and the world was primed for a collision that no amount of diplomacy could now avert. Constantinople, 1908. While the great powers were busy measuring the tonnage of their battleships and carving up the distant reaches of Africa, a far more volatile and localized storm was gathering in the southeast. If the rest of Europe was an armed camp, the Balkans was a powder keg, waiting for a single spark to ignite a conflagration that would consume the entire continent. To understand the Balkan tinderbox, one must understand the slow, agonizing decay of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the sick man of Europe had held sway over the Balkan Peninsula, governing a complex mosaic of ethnicities, religions, and languages. But by the turn of the 20th century, the Ottoman grip was failing. As the empire's central authority withered, it left behind a power vacuum, a fractured landscape of competing identities and ancient grievances. Into this vacuum stepped the rising tide of nationalism. For the various peoples of the Balkans, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Greeks, and the Albanians, the dream of independence was no longer a distant hope. It was an urgent, visceral necessity. They did not merely want to be free from Ottoman rule. They wanted to redraw the map of Europe to reflect their own ethnic boundaries. But these dreams of nationhood were inherently expansionist, and as each new state sought to carve out its own territory, they inevitably collided with their neighbors. This local friction was weaponized by the great powers, turning regional disputes into existential struggles for hegemony. On one side stood the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling, multi-ethnic behemoth that viewed Balkan nationalism as a terminal threat to its own stability. To Vienna, a strong, independent Slavic state in the Balkans, was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Habsburg monarchy. On the other side stood the Kingdom of Serbia. Driven by the ideology of pan-Slavism, Serbia sought to unite the South Slavic peoples into a single, powerful state, a Greater Serbia. This ambition made Belgrade the epicenter of revolutionary fervor, a magnet for nationalist movements that threatened to tear the Austro-Hungarian fabric apart. And then there was Russia. To justify its own imperial ambitions in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the Tsar positioned himself as the protector of the Slavs. By backing Serbia, Russia wasn't just defending a fellow Orthodox nation. It was attempting to assert its influence in a region where it had long been excluded. This turned the Balkans into a high-stakes proxy battleground, where the interests of St. Petersburg and Vienna were on a permanent collision course. The situation reached a breaking point during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In a whirlwind of conflict, the Balkan states successfully stripped the Ottoman Empire of nearly all its European holdings. But the victory was hollow. The wars left behind new borders, new enemies, and a heightened sense of resentment. Serbia emerged larger and more confident, while Austria-Hungary grew increasingly paranoid and convinced that only a show of overwhelming force could suppress the Slavic tide. The stage was set. The imperial ambitions of the great powers, the industrial capacity of the arms race, and the explosive nationalism of the Balkans had all converged. The fuse was lit, and the players were moving into position. All that remained was the trigger. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The air in the Bosnian capital was heavy with a tension that few truly understood, but many could feel. It was a day of profound symbolic significance. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the complex and fracturing Austro-Hungarian throne, had arrived to inspect imperial troops. To the Habsburgs, it was a display of authority. To the Serbian nationalists lurking in the shadows, it was an intolerable provocation. Among the crowds lining the streets were several young men, members of a revolutionary group known as Young Bosnia. They were not merely students or dissidents. They were agents of the Black Hand, a shadowy Serbian nationalist society dedicated to the violent liberation of the South Slavs. They carried with them a singular, lethal purpose: to strike a blow against the empire that they believed stood in the way of a greater Serbia. The morning began with a series of chilling coincidences. The Archduke's motorcade, traveling in an open-topped car, followed a route that had been poorly coordinated. As the procession wound through the narrow streets of Sarajevo, the first assassin, a young man named Nedeljko Chabranovic, stepped forward. He hurled a bomb at the royal vehicle, but the timing was off. The device struck the folded hood of the car, bouncing off and exploding beneath the vehicle behind it. The Archduke survived. The bomb caused chaos, and the motorcade sped away toward the town hall. In the wake of the explosion, the Archduke was shaken but determined to continue his mission. He insisted on visiting the injured officers in the hospital. It was here that history took its most fateful turn. Due to a communication failure, the driver of the Archduke's car was not informed of the change in route. As the vehicle made a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, the driver realized his mistake and slammed on the brakes. The car came to a halt, idling directly in front of a delicatessen. Standing on the sidewalk just feet away from the stalled vehicle was Gavrilo Princip. One of the earlier assassins had failed, but for Princip, the failure had been transformed into a miracle of circumstance. He did not hesitate. Stepping toward the car, he drew a pistol and fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck. The second hit his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. In a matter of seconds, the heir to one of Europe's greatest empires and his beloved wife were dying in the streets of a provincial Balkan city. The silence that followed the shots was deafening. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not just a political murder. It was the spark that fell into the very powder keg we have been discussing. The assassins had intended to trigger a local revolution, but they had inadvertently triggered a global catastrophe. In Vienna, the outrage was immediate and visceral. The Habsburgs saw this not as a criminal act, but as a direct strike by the Serbian state against the sovereignty of the empire. The machinery of the alliance system, which we will explore in the next chapter, began to grind into motion. The diplomatic cables were being drafted, the mobilizations were being ordered, and the great powers were being pulled toward a conflict that none of them could truly control. The trigger had been pulled, and the world was about to descend into the abyss. Vienna, July 1914. The news of the assassination had reached the halls of the Hofburg Palace not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a casus belli, a cause for war. For the Austro-Hungarian leadership, the shots fired in Sarajevo were the ultimate proof that Serbian nationalism was a cancer eating away at the heart of their multi-ethnic empire. They knew they had to act, but they also knew that any move against Serbia risked a confrontation with Russia, the self-appointed protector of the Slavic people. This was the terrifying calculus of the July crisis. Diplomacy, which had governed European relations for decades, was being replaced by the cold, calculated logic of military mobilization. The Austro-Hungarian government, desperate to crush the Serbian threat once and for all, turned to their most powerful ally, Germany. In a move that would change the course of human history, Kaiser Wilhelm II issued what became known as the blank check. Berlin promised Vienna unconditional support, regardless of the consequences. It was a fatal error in judgment. Instead of encouraging restraint, the German guarantee emboldened the Austrians to pursue a policy of aggression rather than diplomacy. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It was a document designed to be rejected. It contained 10 draconian demands, many of which were intended to strip Serbia of its very sovereignty. The terms were so severe that they left no room for a dignified Serbian response. For a few tense days, the world held its breath. Serbia, backed by the cautious guidance of Russia, agreed to almost every point, but they could not accept the terms that would allow Austrian officials to operate within Serbian territory to suppress domestic dissent. The clock was now ticking. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The dominoes began to fall with a speed that stunned the diplomats in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. Russia, feeling the weight of its prestige and the pressure of its military planners, began the process of partial mobilization to support Serbia. In the rigid logic of 1914, mobilization was not merely a threat, it was an act of war. To mobilize was to prepare the gears of destruction, and once those gears began to turn, they were almost impossible to stop. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization as a direct threat, activated its own war plans. Their strategy was dictated by the Schlieffen Plan, a massive, high-stakes gamble to avoid a two-front war by crushing France quickly before turning east to face the slow-moving Russian steamroller. To reach France, Germany would have to violate the neutrality of Belgium, a small but sovereign nation that served as a buffer between the great powers. When Germany demanded passage through Belgium and was refused, Great Britain was pulled into the fray. The British government, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, found itself standing on the precipice. On August 4th, the ultimatum to Germany expired. The July crisis had reached its end. The failed diplomacy of the last 5 weeks had failed to contain the fire. Instead, it had fed the flames. The localized conflict in the Balkans had successfully cascaded through the web of alliances, transforming a single act of political violence into a total war that would consume the entire civilized world. The era of empires was over. The era of slaughter had begun. Berlin, August 1914. As the declarations of war echoed across the continent, the German High Command was no longer looking at diplomatic cables or telegrams. They were looking at a stopwatch. For the German military, time was the most precious commodity in existence, and the ticking of that clock was dictated by a singular, audacious, and incredibly dangerous strategy: the Schlieffen Plan. To understand the Schlieffen Plan, one must understand the nightmare that haunted every German strategist: the two-front war. Germany sat uncomfortably in the center of Europe, squeezed between the formidable French Republic to the west and the vast, seemingly inexhaustible Russian Empire to the east. If Germany fought both simultaneously, they would be crushed between two millstones. The plan, devised by Count Alfred von Schlieffen years earlier, was a desperate attempt to cheat this mathematical certainty. The logic was as simple as it was ruthless. The German planners believed that Russia, due to its massive size and underdeveloped infrastructure, would be slow to mobilize. They estimated it would take the Russian steamroller at least 6 weeks to gather its forces and move toward the German border. This 6-week window was the pivot upon which the entire war would turn. The Schlieffen Plan proposed that Germany should use those 42 days to deliver a knockout blow to France. But there was a problem. The Franco-German border was heavily fortified, a line of steel and concrete designed to make a direct frontal assault a suicidal endeavor. To bypass these defenses, Schlieffen's solution was a massive, sweeping right hook. The plan called for a colossal force to swing through the neutral territory of Belgium, bypassing the French fortifications entirely. This massive wing of the German army would sweep through the Belgian plains, race through northern France, encircle Paris, and drive the French army back toward the Swiss border in a whirlwind of movement and violence. Once France was defeated and knocked out of the conflict, the German army would then pivot east, boarding trains and rushing to the Russian frontier to meet the slow-moving Slavic masses. It was a plan of breathtaking scale, a masterpiece of logistics and timing that demanded absolute precision. There was no margin for error. If the French didn't collapse quickly, if the Belgians held out longer than expected, or if the Russians mobilized faster than anticipated, the entire German house of cards would come crashing down. As the German boots began to trample the soil of Belgium, the plan was set in motion. The German military was not just fighting a war, they were racing against a calendar. They believed they were executing a surgical strike that would end the war before it truly began. They believed that speed would substitute for depth, and that momentum would substitute for security. But as the German right wing surged forward, They were not just moving through neutral Belgium. They were tearing up the fabric of international law and inviting the full might of the British Empire into the struggle. The Schlieffen Plan was a gamble of cosmic proportions, a high-stakes attempt to win a war through sheer velocity. As the first German columns crossed the Belgian border, the world watched, unaware that this grand strategic maneuver was about to collide with the brutal reality of modern warfare, setting the stage for a catastrophe that no one, not even the architects of the plan, could have truly envisioned. September 1914, the Marne River, France. The German right hook was no longer a theoretical maneuver on a map. It was a thundering reality of steel and blood. The German First and Second Armies had swept through Belgium and into northern France with a ferocity that defied expectation. They were the unstoppable force, a massive tidal wave of infantry and artillery that seemed destined to swallow the French Republic whole. For the German High Command, victory was not just a possibility, it felt inevitable. They were mere miles from Paris, and the French government was already preparing to flee the capital. But the gears of the Schlieffen Plan were beginning to grind. The sheer scale of the German advance had created a fatal flaw. The right wing was becoming dangerously overextended. The gap between the German advancing armies and their supporting elements was widening, stretching the German supply lines to the breaking point. The soldiers were exhausted, marching through heat and dust, fueled by the desperate hope that the end was near. Meanwhile, the French and British forces were reeling. The French army, under the command of General Joseph Joffre, had been forced into a frantic, retreating posture. But Joffre was not a man to succumb to panic. He realized that the German momentum was a double-edged sword. The faster they moved, the thinner their lines became. He saw a window of opportunity, a moment where the German juggernaut might stumble. As the German forces neared the Marne, the atmosphere was one of suffocating tension. The French were desperately regrouping, pulling troops from the Eastern Front where the Russian steamroller had unexpectedly begun to move, much faster than German intelligence had predicted. The two-front nightmare was no longer a theory, it was becoming a reality. Then came the turning point. In a move of incredible tactical audacity, Joffre ordered a massive counteroffensive. The French, bolstered by the arrival of the British Expeditionary Force, struck at the weakened gap in the German lines. The German commanders, sensing the shift in the wind, realized they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. In a moment of high-stakes desperation, German troops were actually ordered to disembark from taxis, the famous taxis of the Marne, to rush to the front lines to plug the holes in their crumbling flank. The battle that erupted along the Marne was a chaotic, visceral struggle. It was not the clean, decisive victory the German planners had envisioned. It was a brutal, grinding collision of two massive military machines. For several days, the fate of Western Europe hung in the balance. The German attempt to encircle Paris failed. The momentum that had carried them through Belgium evaporated in the mud and blood of the riverbanks. By early September, the German retreat had begun. The knockout blow had missed. The Schlieffen Plan, the masterpiece of German strategic thought, had failed. The war of movement, defined by rapid marches and sweeping maneuvers, was dying on the banks of the Marne. As the German armies retreated to more defensible positions, the French and British began to move forward, not to victory, but to a grim realization. They would not be chasing the enemy out of France. They would be digging in to face them. The era of the great maneuver was over. The era of the trenches had begun. September 1914, the Marne River, France. The momentum of the German advance had stalled, replaced by a frantic, desperate attempt to stabilize a collapsing front. As the German armies pulled back from the gates of Paris, a new and bizarre phenomenon began to emerge on the battlefield. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough, yet neither side was willing to yield the ground they had bled for. What followed was not a single battle, but a series of rapid, lateral movements that would change the face of the war forever. It was a strategic game of cat and mouse played on a continental scale, a frantic attempt by both the Allied and Central powers to outflank one another. This was the race to the sea. The logic behind this movement was simple, yet incredibly high stakes. Both the French and the British, realizing that the center of the line was now a fortified, impenetrable wall of trenches, began to push their flanks northward. They were searching for the end of the line, the point where the continuous front would finally break, allowing them to swing around the enemy's side and strike at their exposed rear. The German High Command, led by Erich von Falkenhayn, saw the same opportunity. They realized that if they could outmaneuver the Allies to the north, they could potentially seize the vital Channel ports, Calais, Dunkirk, and Boulogne. If Germany controlled these ports, they could choke off the British Expeditionary Force, cutting the lifeline between the United Kingdom and the European continent. For the Germans, the race to the sea was a gamble to win the war by strangling the British presence in France. As the months progressed from September into October, the race became a desperate scramble. The map of Europe was being redrawn in real time by marching columns of infantry and heavy artillery. Every time the French pushed north, the Germans responded with a massive movement to the flank. Every time the British attempted to extend their line, the Germans moved to intercept. It was a rhythmic, violent dance of maneuver. The scale of the movement was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were being shifted like chess pieces across the landscape of northern France and Belgium. The sheer exhaustion of the troops was mounting, yet the pace did not slacken. The armies moved through the rolling hills of Picardy, through the dense forests of Flanders, and toward the coastal marshes of the North Sea. But as the armies raced toward the coast, they were running out of room. The geography of Europe was narrowing. The vast, open plains that had allowed for the sweeping maneuvers of the summer were being replaced by the restrictive, waterlogged terrain of the Belgian coast. By late October and into November, the race reached its conclusion. The two sides had finally run out of flank. They had reached the edge of the continent, where the land met the freezing waters of the English Channel. There was nowhere left to turn, nowhere left to outflank, and nowhere left to run. The lateral movement stopped abruptly. The frantic marching gave way to a grim, static reality. The line had finally closed, stretching from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea, forming a continuous, unbroken arc of fortifications. The race to the sea was over. The maneuvering was dead. What remained was a frozen, blood-soaked scar across the earth, a line of trenches that would not move for the next 4 years. November 1914, Flanders, Belgium. The frantic, sweeping movements of the autumn have vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. The great armies of Europe, which only months ago believed they would be home by Christmas, now find themselves paralyzed. They have reached the end of the world, or so it seems, staring across a narrow strip of mud and blood at an enemy they can no longer bypass. The era of maneuver is dead. The era of the spade has begun. The transition from movement to stagnation was not a conscious strategic choice, but a desperate necessity for survival. As the armies reached the limits of their flanks, they found themselves exposed to the devastating power of modern weaponry. The machine gun, a weapon of terrifying efficiency, had turned the open field into a death trap. To stand upright was to invite certain death. To move across open ground was to commit suicide. To survive, the soldier had to go down. At first, these efforts were rudimentary. Soldiers would simply crouch in shallow depressions or dive into shell holes left by heavy artillery. These scrapes offered little protection against the elements or the relentless rain of steel. But as the realization set in that this stalemate might last weeks, months, or even years, the digging became more systematic, more industrial, and more profound. The landscape of northern France and Belgium began to transform. What were once rolling hills, fertile farmlands, and quaint villages were systematically dismantled and repurposed into a subterranean world. Men labored in freezing mud, carving out networks of ditches that grew deeper and more complex with every passing day. They dug fire trenches to hold the line, support trenches to house reserves, and communication trenches to allow for the movement of supplies and the evacuation of the wounded. But a single ditch was not enough. To withstand the unprecedented weight of industrial artillery, these lines had to become fortresses. Engineers and infantrymen alike worked to create zigzag patterns to prevent enfilade fire from traveling down the length of a trench. They built sandbagged parapets to provide cover and dug deep dugouts into the earth, attempting to create small, claustrophobic sanctuaries against the terrifying vibrations of incoming shells. As the winter of 1914 set in, the reality of trench warfare revealed its true, grim character. This was not just a military problem, it was a battle against nature itself. The trenches became labyrinthine ecosystems of filth and decay. Waterlogged ditches turned into rivers of sludge, leading to trench foot, a horrific condition that could rot the flesh from a soldier's bones. Rats, emboldened by the abundance of human remains, grew to monstrous proportions, scurrying through the dark corridors of the lines. The earth itself was being hollowed out. The soldiers were no longer fighting just the enemy across the wire. They were fighting the mud, the cold, the lice, and the crushing psychological weight of living in a hole. The landscape was being reshaped into a scar of attrition, a jagged, broken line of earthworks that stretched hundreds of miles. The lines were set. The earth had been breached. The war had ceased to be a contest of brilliant generals and rapid marches, and had become a grueling, subterranean struggle for every inch of dirt. The soldiers had dug in, and in doing so, they had trapped themselves in a nightmare of static, industrial slaughter. Early 1915, the Western Front. The lines have hardened, and the map of Europe has been frozen into a jagged, unmoving scar. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, a continuous wall of earth and wire now separates the combatants. This is the stalemate, a strategic paralysis that neither the German High Command nor the Allied Supreme Command could have predicted, yet neither could escape. The fundamental question of the war had changed. It was no longer, how do we outmaneuver the enemy? It was now, how do we break through a line that is anchored by millions of men and miles of fortifications? To understand why the stalemate became so impenetrable, one must understand the lethal imbalance between offense and defense. In 1914, the world's military doctrines were built on the cult of the offensive, the belief that spirit, courage, and rapid movement could overcome any obstacle. But the Industrial Revolution had fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement. The defensive power of the modern battlefield had become overwhelming. The primary architect of this deadlock was the machine gun. A single well-placed crew could sweep 100 yards of terrain with a continuous curtain of lead, making any infantry charge an exercise in futility. When combined with the sheer volume of heavy artillery, the defensive position became almost impregnable. Artillery, the king of battle, could now reach far behind the enemy lines, pulverizing supply routes, destroying communication, and turning the very ground into a lunar wasteland. To attack was to march into a zone of concentrated, mechanical destruction. The generals attempted to find a solution. They sought to break the deadlock through massive, concentrated artillery bombardments. The theory was simple. Shell the enemy trenches until their wire is cut, their dugouts are collapsed, and their spirit is broken. Then the infantry would rush forward to occupy the ruins. But this strategy birthed a new, even more terrifying cycle of violence. The more intense the bombardment, the more the landscape was obliterated. The no-man's land between the trenches became a chaotic sea of craters, mud, and tangled barbed wire, making it nearly impossible for attacking troops to maintain formation or move forward. Furthermore, the heavy shelling served as a dinner bell for enemy observers. As soon as the infantry climbed out of their trenches, the defenders would call down precisely calibrated artillery fire on the exact coordinates of the attack. For every mile gained, the cost was measured in tens of thousands of lives. The stalemate created a mathematical horror, a war of attrition. If the armies could not move forward, they would instead attempt to wear the enemy down, to bleed them dry until one side's manpower or industrial capacity finally buckled. The war had transitioned from a contest of movement to a contest of endurance. It was no longer about the brilliance of a maneuver or the speed of a cavalry charge. It was about who could endure the most misery, who could produce the most shells, and who could sustain the most casualties before collapsing. The soldiers were no longer players in a grand game of chess. They were the fuel being fed into a massive, industrial furnace. The stalemate was not merely a pause in the fighting. It was the new, horrific reality of modern war. Early 1915, the Western Front. If the trenches were the two opposing sides of a lethal equation, then the space that lay between them was the void where logic and humanity went to die. This was no man's land. It was not merely a gap in the lines. It was a psychological and physical wasteland. To the soldiers peering through the periscopes and slits of their parapets, no man's land was a landscape stripped of its soul. The rolling hills and fertile farmlands of France and Belgium had been pulverized into a moonscape of jagged craters and stagnant, waist-deep sludge. There were no trees left standing, only blackened, skeletal stumps that looked like grasping fingers reaching out from the earth. There was no grass, no soil, only a churned-up slurry of mud, blood, and the debris of industrial slaughter. The terrain was further complicated by the iron forest, miles upon miles of tangled, concertina-style barbed wire. This was not just an obstacle, it was a trap. It was designed to snag, to entangle, and to slow the advancing infantry just long enough for the machine guns to find their range. To step into no man's land was to enter a kill zone where the very ground conspired to hold you in place, while death descended from above. But the horror of no man's land was not found only in the geography. It was found in the sensory overload of the experience. It was a place of constant, deafening noise, the rhythmic thud of distant artillery, the terrifying, mechanical zip-zip of bullets passing overhead, and the sudden, earth-shaking explosions of shells landing nearby. In the rare moments of silence, The sounds were perhaps even more haunting. The low moans of the wounded, trapped in the mud and unable to reach their own lines, calling out for help that would never come. The psychological weight of this space was crushing. For the infantrymen, no man's land represented the ultimate unknown. It was a vacuum of existence. To go over the top meant leaving the relative, albeit filthy, sanctuary of the trench to enter a space where you were no longer a man, but a target. You were a silhouette against a gray sky, a moving object in a landscape designed to destroy movement. The terror of the jump into that void created a state of chronic, soul-eroding anxiety that no amount of training could prepare a soldier for. Furthermore, no man's land became a graveyard of the living and the dead. Because the ground was so treacherous and the fire so intense, retrieving the fallen was often a suicidal mission. Consequently, the landscape became littered with the remnants of previous assaults. Corpses, sometimes weeks old, were left to bloat in the rain or sink into the mire, becoming part of the very topography of the battlefield. The smell, a sickening cocktail of cordite, overflowing latrines and decaying flesh, became the permanent atmosphere of the front. In this space, the individual was erased. The grand ambitions of emperors and the strategic maneuvers of generals were distilled down to this singular, wretched reality. A few hundred yards of cratered filth that men were ordered to die for, over and over again. No man's land was the physical manifestation of the Great War's central paradox, a massive, high-tech industrial effort dedicated to the occupation of a space that was essentially uninhabitable. It was the theater of the absurd, where the price of a few meters of mud was measured in the lives of an entire generation. April 22, 1915, near the village of Langemarck, Belgium. For months, the stalemate of the trenches had been defined by the physical, the weight of the mud, the sting of the shrapnel, and the rhythmic cruelty of the machine gun. But on this spring afternoon, the nature of death itself would undergo a terrifying metamorphosis. As the Allied troops looked out across the scarred expanse of no man's land, they did not see a sudden charge of infantry or the flash of artillery. Instead, they saw something that defied the logic of conventional warfare. A creeping, yellowish-green cloud, drifting low across the churned earth like a spectral tide. This was chlorine gas. When the German artillery opened fire that day, they weren't just aiming to destroy fortifications. They were aiming to release a silent, invisible predator. As the wind carried the cloud toward the French and Algerian colonial divisions, the soldiers realized with mounting horror that they were facing an enemy they could not shoot, could not outrun, and could not hide from. The gas did not strike like a bullet, it seeped. It rolled into the depressions of the trenches, filled the shell holes, and hung in the air, hungry and pervasive. The sensation was one of immediate primal panic. To breathe was to invite a slow, agonizing destruction. Chlorine gas is a powerful irritant. As it makes contact with the moisture in the lungs, eyes, and throat, it turns into hydrochloric acid. It creates a sensation of drowning on dry land. Men clawed at their throats, their lungs filling with fluid as they struggled for air that had become poison. The screams of the dying were not the sharp cries of a wound, but the wet, choking gasps of men being liquefied from the inside out. The psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than the physical toll. In the trenches, a soldier could prepare for a shell or a bayonet charge. There was a certain grim familiarity to the steel and the cordite, but gas introduced a dimension of terror that was elemental. It turned the very air, the most basic necessity of life, into a weapon of execution. It stripped away the last vestiges of dignity from combat. There was no courage to be found in a gas attack. There was only the desperate, frantic scramble for a rag, a piece of cloth, or a primitive mask, hoping to stave off a death that felt more like a curse than a casualty. As the war progressed, the chemical landscape grew even more sinister. The terrifying novelty of chlorine gave way to the even more lethal innovations of science. There was phosgene, a colorless killer that could be inhaled without immediate realization, only to claim the victim hours later in a sudden, violent collapse. And then came mustard gas, the king of battle gases. Unlike its predecessors, mustard gas was a blistering agent. It did not just attack the lungs. It settled into the soil and the clothing, clinging to the skin and eyes. It caused massive, weeping chemical burns and permanent blindness, turning the battlefield into a landscape of agonizing, slow-motion trauma. The introduction of chemical warfare marked the final descent of the Great War into the realm of the industrial grotesque. It was the ultimate expression of a war that had lost its humanity. No longer was the soldier merely a combatant in a clash of nations. He had become a laboratory subject in a global experiment of mass suffering. The gas proved that in this new era of total war, science would not be used to preserve life, but to perfect the art of making death as efficient, as inescapable, and as horrific as possible. August 4, 1914, the North Sea. While the horrific evolution of chemical warfare was beginning to scar the earth of Flanders, a different, more silent struggle was unfolding across the vast, gray expanses of the world's oceans. If the trenches represented a war of agonizing stagnation, the sea represented a war of vital necessity. For the British Empire, the ocean was not merely a battlefield. It was a lifeline. It was the umbilical cord that connected London to its colonies, its food supplies, and its vast industrial resources. To sever that cord was to starve a nation into submission. At the outbreak of hostilities, the naval conflict was defined by a grand, traditional confrontation, the clash of dreadnoughts. The British Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the waves, sought to maintain a distant blockade of Germany, choking off the Central Powers from the global market. In response, the German Imperial Navy, though smaller, sought to challenge this supremacy through concentrated sorties and the pursuit of a decisive fleet engagement. This tension would eventually culminate in the titanic clash at the Battle of Jutland, where the largest collection of steel and firepower ever assembled met in a chaotic symphony of smoke and thunder. But as the stalemate on land deepened, the nature of naval combat underwent a radical, predatory transformation. The surface fleets, massive and visible, found themselves increasingly unable to break the deadlock. It was then that the war moved beneath the waves. The German Navy, realizing it could not match the sheer weight of the British Grand Fleet in a surface battle, turned to a more insidious weapon, the U-boat. The unterseeboot, the submarine, was a technological phantom. It was a vessel that operated in the shadows, invisible to the naked eye, capable of striking with sudden, lethal precision before vanishing back into the crushing depths. By 1915, the German High Command realized that the U-boat offered a way to bypass the British blockade and strike directly at the heart of the Allied war effort. Their strategy shifted from tactical naval engagements to a campaign of economic strangulation. This was the birth of unrestricted submarine warfare. The rules of engagement that had governed the seas for centuries, the requirement to surface, warn merchant vessels, and allow crews to escape were cast aside in favor of total, invisible attrition. The impact was psychological as much as it was material. For merchant sailors, the ocean was no longer a highway of commerce, but a hunting ground. The sudden, violent explosion of a torpedo beneath a hull, the sight of a ship tilting into the abyss, and the frantic scramble for lifeboats became the new reality of maritime life. The U-boat turned every cargo ship, every grain freighter, and every troop transport into a potential target. As the German submarines began to sink hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, the British responded with the convoy system, grouping merchant vessels under the protection of armed escorts. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse played across thousands of miles of trackless water. The sea had become a front line as volatile and unforgiving as any trench, proving that in the era of total war, the struggle for survival was being fought not just in the mud of Europe, but in the very depths of the world's oceans. February 21, 1916, Verdun, France. While the predators of the deep were hunting merchant ships across the Atlantic, a different kind of slaughter was being prepared on the hills of northeastern France. If the submarine warfare in the Atlantic was a war of invisible attrition, the struggle for Verdun would be its most visceral, most concentrated, and most hellish manifestation on land. The stage was set by a man with a singular, terrifying vision, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn. He did not seek a traditional breakthrough or a grand maneuver of encirclement. Instead, he looked at the map of the Western Front and identified a wound that would never heal. Verdun was a fortress city, a symbol of French national pride and military resolve. Falkenhayn's logic was cold and mathematical. He believed that by attacking this sacred ground, he could force the French army to defend it at any cost. He did not intend to capture the city so much as to bleed the French army white. His goal was to turn Verdun into a meat grinder, a place where the sheer weight of German artillery would consume the lifeblood of the French Republic. The assault began with a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. On the morning of February 21, the German artillery unleashed a deluge of fire unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Thousands of guns, working in terrifying unison, rained hundreds of thousands of shells onto the French positions. It was not a battle, it was an industrial bombardment. The landscape itself was being reshaped. Forests were leveled, hills were pulverized into craters, and the soil was churned into a soup of blood and mud. As the German infantry surged forward through the smoke, they were met by the desperate, unyielding resistance of the French defenders. The French, caught by the initial violence, rallied under the slogan "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. The fighting devolved into a primitive, claustrophobic nightmare. Men fought hand-to-hand in trenches that were often nothing more than jagged ditches carved into the debris of former villages. The air was thick with the stench of cordite, decaying flesh, and the copper tang of blood. To sustain this unprecedented level of combat, a new lifeline was required. The French relied on a single, narrow road leading into the heart of the fortress, the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. Through a feat of monumental logistical endurance, thousands of trucks moved in a constant, rhythmic procession, bringing men, ammunition, and food to the front, and carrying the broken and the dead away. It was a pulse of survival in a landscape of death. For 10 months the battle raged. The names of the hills, Douaumont, Vaux, Mortham, became synonymous with the absolute limits of human endurance. The meat grinder lived up to its name, but it worked both ways. The German army, having drawn the French into their trap, found themselves caught in the same vortex of attrition. Both sides were being consumed by the very machine they had built. By the time the offensive sputtered to a halt in December, the cost was incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands of men lay dead or wounded in a landscape that had been rendered unrecognizable. Verdun did not decide the war, but it changed it forever. It proved that in the age of industrial warfare, the objective was no longer territory, but the systematic exhaustion of the enemy's very soul. July 1, 1916, the Somme River, Picardy, France. If Verdun was a concentrated wound, the Somme was intended to be the final, decisive blow. As the French army struggled to survive the meat grinder of Verdun, the British and French high commands sought a way to relieve the pressure. They needed a massive, coordinated offensive that would shatter the German lines and break the long-standing stalemate of the Western Front. The plan was ambitious, almost unimaginably vast. It was to be a battle of unprecedented scale, involving over 1 million men on the British side alone. The British, led by General Douglas Haig, believed that a week-long, unrelenting artillery bombardment could destroy the German barbed wire, flatten their trenches, and kill their defenders, leaving a clear path for the infantry to simply walk through. They believed the industrial power of the British Empire could, through sheer weight of steel, pave the way to victory. At 7:30 a.m., the silence of the morning was shattered. A colossal curtain of fire erupted across the front lines. For 7 days, British guns had pounded the German positions, firing over 1 million shells. As the whistles blew, the British infantry climbed out of their trenches and moved toward the enemy lines. They did so with a sense of grim determination, believing the bombardment had done its job. They expected to find a wasteland of broken German spirits. Instead, they walked into a massacre. The German artillery, dug deep into reinforced bunkers, had survived the storm. As the British soldiers crested their parapets, the German machine gunners emerged from their shelters and began to fire. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The British troops, many of them young, inexperienced volunteers, the Kitchener's army, were caught in the open, moving through no man's land under a hail of lead. The air was filled with the rhythmic, terrifying stutter of machine guns, a sound that would become the anthem of the Somme. By the end of the first day, the scale of the catastrophe was impossible to grasp. The British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties in a single day, the deadliest day in the history of the British military. The ground was no longer earth. It was a churned, crimson mire of mud and broken bodies. The Somme did not end on that first day. It dragged on for 4 agonizing months, evolving into a slow, grinding struggle of inches. The promised breakthrough never came. Instead, the battle became a terrifying evolution of modern combat. It was here that the world saw the first true glimpse of the tank, clumsy, iron beasts that crawled through the mud, attempting to crush wire and provide mobile cover. It was here that the skies grew dark with the first dogfights of aerial combat. But technology could not outpace the carnage. The battle became a repetitive cycle of massive artillery barrages followed by futile infantry charges, resulting in staggering losses for both sides. By the time the offensive was called off in November, the numbers were apocalyptic. Over 1 million men had been killed, wounded, or went missing. The Somme failed to break the German army, and it failed to win the war for the Allies. Yet, it achieved something else. It signaled the total transformation of warfare into an industrial process of mass expiration. The Somme was the moment the world realized that the Great War would not be won by gallantry or grand maneuvers, but by which empire could endure the greatest level of organized, mechanized slaughter. August 1916. The vast, rolling plains of East Prussia and the Galician borderlands. While the Western Front had devolved into a stagnant, claustrophobic nightmare of trenches and barbed wire, the war in the East was a different beast entirely. Here, the geography was too vast, the lines too long, and the populations too diverse for the static deadlock of France. On the Eastern Front, the war was defined by movement, by sweeping maneuvers, and by the terrifying realization that the sheer scale of the landscape could swallow entire armies whole. If the Western Front was a meat grinder, the Eastern Front was a chaotic, shifting sea of fire. It was a theater of immense proportions, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, pitting the massive, yet fracturing, Russian Empire against the disciplined, professional machines of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. The Russian steamroller, fueled by an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower, initially caught the Central Powers off guard. In the early months of the war, Russian forces had surged into East Prussia, forcing the German High Command to divert precious divisions from the west to prevent a total collapse in the east. But this momentum was a mirage. The Russian Imperial Army, though vast, was a house built on sand. Its soldiers were often poorly trained, poorly equipped, and most critically, poorly fed. While the German industry churned out shells and rifles with terrifying efficiency, the Russian soldier often went into battle with little more than a bolt-action rifle and a prayer, waiting for supplies that were frequently lost to corruption or logistical incompetence. By the summer of 1916, the tide began to turn with a crushing weight. The German strategy was no longer about mere defense. It was about the systematic dismantling of the Russian state. At the Battle of Gorlice-Tarnow, a massive German-Austrian offensive shattered the Russian lines, sending millions of men into a panicked retreat. The Russian army didn't just lose ground, it began to lose its soul. As the fighting intensified, the Eastern Front became a theater of massive, sweeping encirclements. Armies would march for hundreds of miles, only to find themselves trapped in vast pockets of territory, surrounded by enemy steel. The scale of these movements meant that there was no man's land in the traditional sense. Instead, there was a vast, shifting zone of devastation where entire provinces were turned into scorched earth. But the true enemy for Russia was not just the German bayonet, it was the rot within. As the casualties mounted into the millions, the disconnect between the front lines and the home front became an unbridgeable chasm. In the cities, bread riots turned into political uprisings. The soldiers, exhausted by years of futile slaughter and realizing their commanders were sacrificing them for nothing, began to look toward the revolutionary fervor spreading through the ranks. The Eastern Front was more than just a secondary theater of war. It was the beginning of the end for the old world order. While the Western Front remained locked in a grim, industrial stalemate, the East was a brewing storm of social and political collapse. The momentum of the war was shifting, not just through military conquest, but through the internal disintegration of an empire. The cracks were forming, and the weight of the Great War was about to shatter the Russian monarchy forever, setting the stage for a revolution that would change the course of human history. September 1916. The muddy, shell-blasted corridors of the Western Front. As the empires of Europe began to fracture from within, A different kind of transformation was taking place on the battlefield. If the Eastern Front was defined by the vastness of geography, the Western Front was being redefined by the terrifying advancement of science. The stalemate of the trenches had created a lethal paradox. The defense had become overwhelmingly superior to the offense. Machine guns and barbed wire could shred an advancing line in seconds, leaving armies paralyzed in a state of perpetual, bloody stagnation. To break this deadlock, the great powers turned to the laboratory and the factory, ushering in an era of technological evolution that would change the face of combat forever. The first great breakthrough in this industrial evolution was the mastery of the skies. In 1914, aircraft were little more than fragile kites, used primarily for reconnaissance, eyes in the sky to spot troop movements. But as the war deepened, the airplane became a weapon of aggression. Pilots transitioned from observers to hunters, engaging in the dizzying, acrobatic dogfights that would become the stuff of legend. No longer just tools for spying, planes were outfitted with synchronized machine guns, allowing them to strafe infantry and conduct strategic bombing raids, turning the very concept of the rear area into a front line. Yet even as men took to the air, the ground remained a graveyard of steel. The heavy artillery had become the undisputed king of the battlefield. No longer just a support tool, massive howitzers were now capable of firing shells that could pulverize entire fortifications from miles away. The creeping barrage, a timed curtain of falling steel designed to shield advancing infantry, became a standard, albeit terrifying, tactic. But the sheer volume of high explosives created a new kind of hell, a landscape stripped of life, where the earth itself was churned into a lunar wasteland of craters and mud. It was within this hellscape that the most desperate attempt to break the trench deadlock emerged. The tank. Born from the British desire to cross no man's land, these lumbering, ironclad monsters were the first true marriage of internal combustion and heavy armor. When the first British Mark I tanks rolled into combat, they were slow, mechanically unreliable, and prone to breaking down, but they offered something the infantry had never had: mobile protection. They could crush barbed wire, shrug off machine gun fire, and provide a psychological shock that no amount of traditional courage could match. The tank was the beginning of a new doctrine, the end of the age of the horse and the dawn of mechanized warfare. Even more insidious was the evolution of chemistry. The air itself had become a weapon. The introduction of poison gas, from the choking clouds of chlorine to the blistering agony of mustard gas, brought a new, invisible dimension to the horror. It was a weapon that bypassed the strength of a soldier's arm and targeted his very breath, forcing men to live and fight behind suffocating rubber masks. This was no longer a war of heroes and grand maneuvers. It was a war of engineers and chemists. The technological evolution of 1916 signaled a grim reality. The individual soldier was being eclipsed by the machine. The Great War had become a contest of industrial output, where the victor would not be the one with the bravest men, but the one with the most efficient factories. February 1917, Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire. While the Western Front was a stagnant nightmare of steel and chemistry, the Eastern Front was a vast, bleeding wound that stretched across hundreds of miles of rolling plains and dense forests. Here, the war was defined not by the crushing pressure of the trenches, but by the terrifying scale of movement and the sheer impossibility of logistics. But by the dawn of 1917, The Russian Empire was no longer merely fighting a war against Germany. It was fighting a war against its own disintegration. The Russian steamroller, which had once seemed capable of overwhelming the Central Powers through sheer numbers, had finally ground to a halt. The reality on the ground was catastrophic. The imperial army, though vast, was a patchwork of poorly trained conscripts, many of whom lacked even the most basic necessities. Soldiers were sent into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front with boots that fell apart in the mud, rifles with no ammunition, and a desperate lack of artillery support. The industrial capacity of Russia could not keep pace with the voracious appetite of modern warfare. For every shell fired by a German battery, the Russian soldier often had nothing but a bayonet and a prayer. This military failure fueled a fire that was already smoldering at home. In the cities, the situation was even more dire. The war had paralyzed the Russian economy. The railway lines diverted to support the front left the urban centers starving. Bread lines became the epicenter of a growing, quiet rage. As the winter deepened, the hunger turned into a fever of resentment. The people no longer saw the war as a defense of the motherland, but as a death sentence imposed by an incompetent and disconnected monarchy. In late February, that resentment finally boiled over. What began as spontaneous protests by female textile workers in Petrograd quickly spiraled into a full-scale revolution. The streets were flooded with hungry workers, students, and soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the bloodshed. The Tsar, Nicholas II, found himself trapped in a paradox. The very instrument he relied on to maintain order, the military, was now the primary driver of his downfall. When the orders were given to suppress the crowds, the soldiers did not fire upon the protesters. Instead, they turned their rifles toward their officers. The backbone of the autocracy had snapped. The February Revolution forced the Tsar to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule and leaving a vacuum of power that the fragile provisional government could not hope to fill. The new leadership made a fatal decision. They resolved to honor Russia's alliances and continue the war. It was a decision made with the logic of international diplomacy, but without any regard for the visceral, starving reality of the Russian people. As the provisional government struggled to maintain order, a new and more radical force began to emerge from the shadows of the chaos, the Bolsheviks. Led by Vladimir Lenin, they offered a simple, seductive promise to a broken nation: peace, land, and bread. They did not speak of imperial glory or national honor. They spoke of the immediate end to the slaughter. The Russian collapse was no longer just a military defeat. It was the birth of a political earthquake that would tear the social fabric of Europe apart, leaving one of the world's greatest empires in ruins, and setting the stage for a radical new era of human history. March 1918, Brest-Litovsk, Belarus. If the February Revolution was the fracture that broke the Russian Empire, the October Revolution was the hammer blow that shattered it completely. By the time Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, the Russian state was little more than a ghost. The provisional government had collapsed. The army had dissolved into a chaotic mass of deserting soldiers, and the country was consumed by a brutal civil war. For the Bolsheviks, the survival of their revolution depended on one thing above all else: an immediate exit from the Great War. But the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, were not interested in a graceful withdrawal. They saw an opportunity to transform a tactical retreat into a strategic masterstroke. They did not want a mere ceasefire. They wanted a total surrender that would secure German dominance over Eastern Europe for generations. When the peace negotiations opened in the small town of Brest-Litovsk, the atmosphere was not one of diplomacy, but of extortion. The German delegation, led by the relentless Colonel Max Hoffmann, arrived with an overwhelming military advantage. They held the cards, the territory, and the momentum. On the other side sat a Bolshevik delegation that was ideologically committed to world revolution, but practically powerless to stop the German advance. The negotiations were a brutal exercise in brinkmanship. The Germans issued an ultimatum: sign a treaty that would strip Russia of its most vital assets, or face a total invasion. Lenin, sensing the desperation of his position, initially pushed for a policy of no war, no peace, hoping to stall for time. But the German military machine was moving too fast. As the German armies pushed deeper into Russian territory, capturing vast swaths of land, the Bolsheviks realized that time was a luxury they no longer possessed. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. It was one of the most punitive peace treaties in modern history, far harsher than anything the Allies would eventually impose on Germany at Versailles. The terms were staggering. Russia was forced to renounce its claims to the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. It surrendered control over Ukraine, the breadbasket of the empire, and vast territories in the Caucasus. The map of Eastern Europe was effectively redrawn overnight. Russia lost nearly a third of its population, a third of its agricultural land, and a massive portion of its industrial and coal resources. It was a territorial amputation that left the newborn Soviet state crippled, isolated, and geographically diminished. For Germany, the treaty was a momentary triumph. By knocking Russia out of the war, the Kaiser's high command finally achieved what they had dreamed of since 1914, the ability to move their massive eastern armies to the Western Front. The two-front nightmare was, for a fleeting moment, over. Germany could now concentrate its full, terrifying weight against France and Britain in a final, desperate gamble to win the war before American industrial might could tip the scales. But the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a hollow victory. While it closed the Eastern Front, it had also birthed a radical, vengeful new power in the East, a Soviet state that viewed the old imperial order as an enemy to be destroyed. Germany had won the land, but in doing so, they had set in motion a geopolitical transformation that would eventually haunt them in the decades to come. February 1, 1917, Berlin, Germany. With the Russian Empire collapsing in the East, the German High Command faced a terrifying mathematical reality in the West. The war had become a race against time. They knew that the United States, though still technically neutral, was an industrial titan whose eventual entry into the conflict would bring a tide of manpower and materiel that Germany could not possibly match. To win the war, Germany had to win it now, and they had to win it before the American lion woke from its slumber. The solution, proposed by the relentless military leaders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, was as audacious as it was ruthless. It was a gamble that would target the very lifeline of the British Empire, its maritime supply routes. They turned to the Unterseeboot, the U-boat. Under the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, German U-boats would no longer adhere to the traditional cruiser rules of naval engagement. In the past, a submarine would surface, signal a merchant vessel, allow the crew to escape, and only then sink the ship. But the U-boat was a fragile, cramped vessel, vulnerable to even the smallest amount of resistance. To hunt effectively, the Germans decided they would no longer surface. They would strike from the shadows, torpedoing any vessel, merchant or passenger, neutral or combatant, found within a designated war zone around the British Isles. The logic was cold and clinical. If Germany could sever the Atlantic arteries that fed Great Britain, the island nation would starve into submission within months. It was a strategy of total economic strangulation. For a few months in early 1917, the gamble seemed to be working. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, turning the ocean into a graveyard of merchant hulls. The tonnage of shipping lost was staggering, and for a moment it appeared that the British blockade might be countered by a German blockade of its own. But this tactical brilliance carried a catastrophic strategic risk. By declaring that no ship was safe, Germany was effectively declaring war on the entire world. The sinking of ships carrying neutral goods or passengers was no longer a mere incident of war. It was an act of perceived piracy that ignited a firestorm of international outrage. The American public, which had largely remained isolationist, watched in horror as the blood of its citizens was spilled in the depths of the Atlantic. The ocean was no longer a barrier protecting the Americas. It was a frontline where American lives were being lost to a German policy of indiscriminate slaughter. In the halls of Washington, the debate raged. President Woodrow Wilson, a man committed to the principle of international law, faced immense pressure. The German High Command believed they could win the war before the Americans could react, but they had fundamentally miscalculated the speed of American mobilization. Germany had chosen to trade the moral high ground for a desperate chance at victory. They had unleashed a silent killer beneath the waves, hoping to choke the life out of Britain, only to find that they had inadvertently provided the very spark that would draw the United States into the fray. The U-boat had become the instrument of Germany's greatest tactical hope, and ultimately, its most fatal strategic blunder. January 16, 1917, Berlin, Germany. While the German High Command was gambling on the lethality of the U-boat, a second, even more clandestine plot was unfolding in the shadows of the diplomatic corps. If the submarine warfare was meant to starve Britain, this new endeavor was designed to paralyze the United States before it could ever reach the European battlefield. The German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, knew that the American policy of neutrality was a fragile thing. To shatter it, Germany needed a diversion, a way to keep the American military eyes turned toward the Western Hemisphere, away from the trenches of France. The plan was a masterpiece of geopolitical provocation. Zimmermann drafted a coded telegram to the German minister in Mexico. The message was not merely a diplomatic overture, it was a proposal for a formal military alliance. In its most audacious terms, Germany offered Mexico a deal that seemed almost too incredible to be true. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico, in alliance with Germany and Japan, should attack the United States. But the German offer went further. To ensure Mexico's commitment, Germany promised to provide financial support and, more importantly, to help Mexico reclaim the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. It was a direct attempt to reignite the fires of American territorial insecurity and force Washington to fight a two-front war on its own soil. But Zimmermann had made a fatal error. He had underestimated the reach of modern intelligence. The telegram was not sent via a direct line, but through a complex web of diplomatic cables that passed through various relay points. One of those points was London. The British Intelligence Service, specifically a highly secretive unit known as Room 40, intercepted the transmission. The cryptographers, working tirelessly in the dim light of naval intelligence offices, began the painstaking process of breaking the German code. When the decrypted text finally emerged, it was nothing short of a bombshell. The British held in their hands proof of a German conspiracy to destabilize the Americas. The dilemma for the British was profound. If they shared this intelligence, they would be revealing the existence of Room 40 and the fact that they could read Germany's most sensitive communications, a revelation that would cause the German High Command to immediately change their codes. However, the opportunity to bring the United States into the war was too great to ignore. In early February, the British handed the decrypted telegram to the American government. When President Woodrow Wilson and his cabinet saw the contents, the atmosphere in Washington shifted from cautious observation to controlled fury. The Zimmerman telegram was no longer just a piece of intelligence. It was a smoking gun. It proved that Germany was not merely fighting a war in Europe, but was actively plotting against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United States. The American public, already simmering with resentment over the sinking of merchant ships, erupted. The telegram transformed the conflict from a distant European struggle into a direct threat to the American home. The debate over intervention was over. The American lion was no longer merely waking. It was being provoked into a roar. The telegram would become the definitive catalyst, the final piece of evidence that turned American isolationism into a crusade for democracy. The path to the Atlantic was now open, and the tide of the war was about to change forever. April 6, 1917, Washington, D.C. The declaration of war was a moment of profound gravity. As President Woodrow Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress, the era of American isolationism died. The United States was no longer a bystander, watching the collapse of the old world from across a vast ocean. It was now a combatant, committed to a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. But as the formal declaration echoed through the halls of power, a monumental logistical challenge loomed. The war in Europe had been raging for nearly 3 years. The Allied powers, Britain and France, were not merely exhausted, they were bleeding out. Their armies were depleted, their economies were straining under the weight of total war, and their morale was fracturing under the relentless pressure of attrition. They did not just need help, they needed a transfusion of lifeblood. That lifeblood would arrive in the form of the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF. The scale of the American mobilization was unprecedented in the nation's history. Almost overnight, the United States underwent a total transformation. The sleepy, agrarian nation was forced to become an industrial titan. Factories in the Midwest and along the Atlantic coast pivoted from manufacturing consumer goods to the frantic production of shells, tanks, aircraft, and uniforms. The Selective Service Act was implemented, beginning a massive draft that would soon pull millions of young men out of their homes, farms, and offices, training them for a type of warfare they could scarcely imagine. However, the arrival of the Americans was not a sudden tidal wave, but a slow, mounting swell. For months, the primary contribution from the United States was not soldiers, but supplies. American grain, steel, and munitions began to flow across the Atlantic, providing a vital lifeline to the starving and exhausted trenches of the Western Front. This industrial intervention allowed the Allies to maintain their lines while the American military prepared for combat. By the summer of 1917, the first American divisions began to arrive in French ports like Saint-Nazaire and Brest. These young men, many of whom had never seen a battlefield, arrived with an infectious, almost naive optimism. They were fresh, they were well-fed, and they possessed a sense of purpose that the weary veterans of the Somme and Verdun had long since lost. But the transition from civilian to soldier was brutal. General John J. Pershing, commander of the AEF, faced a daunting task. He refused to simply fold American troops into existing British and French units, insisting instead that the Americans fight as an independent army to ensure the United States had a seat at the ultimate peace table. This meant building an entire military infrastructure from scratch on foreign soil. Hospitals, supply lines, training camps, and vast networks of communication. As the autumn of 1917 turned to the winter of 1918, the sheer math of the situation began to haunt the German high command. While Germany was struggling to replace its losses, the American reservoir was seemingly bottomless. The arrival of the Americans brought more than just manpower. It brought a psychological shift. For the Allies, the arrival of the doughboys felt like a divine reprieve. For the Central Powers, it felt like the shadow of a giant looming over the horizon. The Americans had arrived. The balance of power had shifted, and the final, decisive act of the Great War was about to begin. January 1, 1918, Berlin, Germany. While the arrival of American troops offered a beacon of hope for the Allies, the reality on the ground for the Central Powers was one of creeping, systemic collapse. To understand the final stage of the Great War, one must look past the thunder of the guns and into the hollowed-out shells of the nations fighting them. This was no longer just a contest of tactical brilliance or military valor. It had become a war of exhaustion, a brutal mathematical struggle to see which society would shatter first under the weight of total mobilization. In the German Empire, the turnip winter had passed, but the hunger had not. The British naval blockade had tightened like a noose around the throat of Central Europe, severing the arteries of international trade. For the German civilian, the war was no longer fought on the distant Western Front, but in the empty cupboards of their kitchens and the cold hearths of their homes. Malnutrition was rampant, vitamins were a luxury, and the caloric intake of the working class had plummeted to levels that invited disease and lethargy. The domestic front was fraying. Strikes in industrial centers, once rare, were becoming frequent as workers realized that the victory promised by their leaders was being paid for with the slow starvation of their children. The economic strain was a feedback loop of misery. To fund the war machine, the German government had leaned heavily on printing money, fueling inflation that devalued the mark and eroded any sense of stability. Every shell fired at the front was a loaf of bread stolen from a civilian. The social contract, the silent agreement between the state and its people, was dissolving. As the German high command demanded more sacrifices, the populace began to ask, to what end? Across the map, the other members of the Central Powers were experiencing similar, if not more acute, disintegrations. Austria-Hungary, an empire held together by fragile threads of nationalism and imperial prestige, was beginning to unspool. The diverse ethnic groups within its borders, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, and Italians, were increasingly looking toward the end of the conflict as an opportunity for self-determination. The Austro-Hungarian army was not just losing battles, it was losing its identity. Desertion rates climbed as soldiers realized they were dying for a throne that could no longer feed them or protect them. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, was being pushed to its absolute breaking point. The logistical nightmare of fighting a multi-front war across vast, arid territories had drained its meager resources. The empire was physically and economically spent, its infrastructure unable to support the demands of modern, industrialized warfare. This was the true face of the war in 1918. It was a war of attrition where the battlefield was the entire national organism. The Central Powers were fighting a race against time, attempting to achieve a decisive military victory before their domestic foundations crumbled entirely. They were running on fumes, their soldiers hollow-eyed and their cities silent, staring into a void of mounting debt and dwindling hope. The question was no longer who had the better strategy, but who could endure the unbearable for just one more month. March 21, 1918, the Western Front, France. The silence that had defined the stalemate of the previous years was not broken by a gradual crescendo, but by a sudden, violent rupture. In the early hours of a misty morning, the German High Command, led by the relentless General Erich Ludendorff, launched a gamble of unprecedented scale. This was the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing attempt to strike a knockout blow before the sheer weight of American manpower and industrial might could tip the scales irrevocably in favor of the Allies. The German strategy had evolved. They moved away from the slow, grinding attrition of the past, instead adopting stormtrooper tactics. These were elite, highly trained infiltration units designed to bypass enemy strongpoints and strike deep into the rear, sowing chaos and paralyzing command structures. To support them, the Germans unleashed a terrifying new instrument of war, a massive, concentrated artillery bombardment. Unlike previous barrages that lasted days and signaled an impending attack, this was a short, intense hurricane of high explosives and mustard gas, intended to stun and suffocate the defenders before they even knew the assault had begun. As the fog lifted, the German tide surged forward. In the sectors near Saint-Quentin, the line did not just bend, it shattered. The Allied defenses, stretched thin by the recent withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, were overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of the German advance. For the first time in years, the static nightmare of the trenches vanished, replaced by a frantic, terrifying war of movement. German troops surged through the gaps, capturing miles of territory in a matter of days. The British and French were forced into a chaotic, fighting retreat, struggling to establish new lines of defense as the German momentum seemed unstoppable. To the Allied commanders, it felt as though the war was slipping through their fingers. The German advance threatened to drive a wedge between the British and French armies, potentially reaching the vital rail hubs of Amiens and severing the communication lines of the entire Western Front. If the Germans could reach the sea, the war would be won, and the inevitable American arrival would be rendered a historical footnote. Yet beneath the tactical brilliance of the stormtroopers, the cracks in the German machine were already beginning to show. The offensive was consuming resources at a rate that the starving German economy could not sustain. Every mile gained required thousands of shells and tons of food, supplies that were increasingly non-existent in the hollowed-out cities of Berlin and Vienna. The German soldiers, though victorious in the field, were often as malnourished and exhausted as the enemies they were defeating. The spring offensive was a masterpiece of military execution, a whirlwind of fire and steel that brought the Entente to the very precipice of defeat. It was the final, violent gasp of the old imperial order. Ludendorff had achieved the impossible. He had broken the stalemate. But in doing so, he had also burned the very fuel his empire needed to survive. The question was no longer whether the Germans could break the line, but whether they could actually survive the victory they had so bloodily won. July 15, 1918, the Western Front, France. The momentum of the spring offensive, once a terrifying whirlwind of German steel, had begun to lose its velocity. The hurricane had passed, leaving behind a landscape of cratered earth, stagnant mud, and a mounting pile of casualties that neither side could afford. As the summer heat settled over the shattered remains of the Somme and the Aisne, the German High Command realized a grim reality. They had achieved the breakthrough, but they had failed to achieve the knockout blow. The vital rail hubs remained in Allied hands, and the relentless, rhythmic arrival of American divisions was turning the tide of the war from a sprint into a grueling marathon of endurance. But while the battle lines were still being contested in the mud of France, a far more insidious rot was spreading through the heart of the Central Powers. This was the true breaking point, not a rupture of the trenches, but a collapse of the soul. In the cities of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the turnip winter had long since passed, replaced by a permanent state of starvation. The Allied naval blockade had tightened like a noose, strangling the supply lines of the Central Powers. For the civilian populations, the war was no longer a matter of glory or national destiny. It was a daily, desperate struggle for a single crust of bread. The social contract was disintegrating. Mothers watched their children wither. Workers faced empty cupboards while their leaders demanded more sacrifices for a war that seemed to have no end. The psychological weight of the conflict began to fracture the very foundations of the German military. The soldiers in the trenches, once fueled by a sense of Prussian discipline and imperial pride, were now returning from the front lines hollowed out, disillusioned, and increasingly radicalized. They were hearing rumors of revolution in Russia. They were seeing the reports of hunger at home. The distinction between the soldier and the starving civilian was blurring. The German army was no longer a cohesive machine. It was a collection of exhausted men holding onto a crumbling dream. By late summer, the internal pressure reached a critical mass. In Germany, the growing unrest of the sailors in Kiel and the strikes in the industrial heartlands were no longer isolated incidents of discontent. They were the tremors of an impending earthquake. The domestic front was buckling under the sheer weight of the attrition. The economy was paralyzed, the food supply was non-existent, and the will to fight was evaporating. The German High Command had gambled everything on a single, violent surge to end the war on their terms. They had succeeded in breaking the stalemate of the trenches, but they had failed to break the resolve of the Allies. Instead, they had accelerated their own internal decay. The empire was not being defeated solely by the bayonets of the Entente, but by the systemic failure of its own ability to sustain the cost of existence. As the autumn approached, the German war machine was a hollow shell. The soldiers were fighting for a Kaiser who could no longer feed them, and a nation that could no longer support them. The breaking point had arrived. It was not a single explosion, but a profound, systemic collapse, a realization that the cost of victory had become higher than the cost of surrender. The end was no longer a question of if, but of when. August 8, 1918, Picardy, France. The silence of the summer was shattered not by a single roar, but by a coordinated symphony of destruction. For years, The Western Front had been defined by static, agonizingly slow advances. But as the sun rose over the Somme, the nature of warfare changed once again. This was the beginning of the Hundred Days Offensive, a relentless, rolling series of Allied strikes that would systematically dismantle the German army piece by piece. The opening salvo, launched by the British and French, was a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare. No longer were soldiers expected to simply charge into the teeth of machine guns. Instead, the Allies unleashed a terrifying new doctrine. Massive, creeping artillery barrages preceded the infantry, not just to destroy trenches, but to pulverize the very ground. Beneath the smoke, the newly perfected tanks, the steel beasts of the 20th century, rumbled forward, crushing wire and silencing nests of resistance. Above them, the air was thick with the roar of Allied aircraft, providing reconnaissance and strafing any German movement that dared to surface. This was not a single battle, but a relentless tide. From the Somme to the Hindenburg Line, the Allied commanders, led by the strategic vision of Marshal Ferdinand Foch, refused to give the Germans a moment to breathe. Every time the German High Command rushed reserves to plug a gap in one sector, the Allies struck elsewhere. It was a game of tactical chess played with millions of lives. The German defenders, already hollowed out by starvation and disillusionment, found themselves fighting a ghost they could no longer catch. The Hindenburg Line, the most formidable defensive network ever constructed, was breached. The impenetrable fortifications, designed to absorb the impact of years of attrition, crumbled under the weight of coordinated Allied pressure. As the offensive moved through September and October, the scale of the retreat became a frantic scramble for survival. The German army was no longer conducting a tactical withdrawal. They were in full-scale flight. The logistical backbone of the Central Powers snapped. Retreating units abandoned heavy guns, horses, and artillery in the mud, unable to keep pace with the rapid Allied advance. The sheer speed of the Allied movement meant that German commanders were often receiving orders for positions that had already been lost. The arrival of the American Expeditionary Forces acted as the hammer to the Allied anvil. Fresh, well-equipped, and possessing an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower, the Americans provided the kinetic energy needed to maintain the tempo of the offensive. They were the shock troops of the final push, driving into the heart of the German defense with a ferocity that signaled the end was near. By late October, the geography of the war had been fundamentally rewritten. The German army was being pushed back toward its own borders, its lines of communication severed, and its veteran corps decimated. The offensive had achieved what 4 years of attrition could not. It had broken the German ability to hold ground. The 100 Days had become a death march for the Kaiser's ambitions. The machine had not just been dented, it had been broken. The question was no longer whether the German Empire could win, but whether it could survive the collapse before the final, inevitable silence fell. August 8, 1918, Amiens, France. If the preceding weeks had been a steady, crushing weight, then August 8th was the moment the floor finally gave way. To history, this day would be immortalized by General Erich Ludendorff himself as the Black Day of the German Army. It was the day the illusion of German invincibility did not just crack, it shattered. The dawn broke over the Somme with a sudden, violent intensity. Unlike the prolonged, days-long bombardments of years past, this was a lightning strike. At 4:20 a.m., a massive Allied artillery barrage, supported by hundreds of tanks and thousands of aircraft, tore into the German lines. This was the all-arms warfare we have discussed, a terrifying, synchronized onslaught where the infantry, the tanks, and the planes moved as a single, lethal organism. The German defenders, stationed in the deep, reinforced trenches of the Somme, found themselves utterly paralyzed. The tanks, once seen as slow-moving curiosities, were now the vanguard of a mechanized nightmare. They rolled through the barbed wire like iron monsters, silencing machine gun nests before the German soldiers could even find their footing. For the men in the trenches, the sensory overload was total. The earth shook with the impact of heavy shells, the sky screamed with the roar of Allied planes, and the ground itself seemed to heave under the weight of the advancing steel. By midday, the results were catastrophic. The British Fourth Army, bolstered by massive French support and the fresh energy of American divisions, had sliced through the German front. In a matter of hours, miles of territory that had been held with such pride and blood were lost. But it wasn't just the loss of ground that signaled the disaster. It was the loss of cohesion. For the first time in the war, the German retreat was not a controlled, tactical maneuver. It was a collapse. The rapid pace of the Allied advance meant that German communication lines were severed almost instantly. Officers were shouting orders into the void. Runners were being killed before they could reach the rear. The German soldier, already hollowed out by the British naval blockade and the exhaustion of years of fighting, looked at the horizon and saw not a retreating enemy, but an unstoppable tide. Panic, that most infectious of battlefield emotions, began to spread through the ranks. Units that had stood firm at Verdun and the Somme in years prior began to dissolve. Men abandoned their heavy machine guns, their artillery, and their dignity, fleeing into the woods and the mud to escape the relentless pressure. The German High Command watched in horror as their carefully constructed defensive lines turned into corridors of retreat. Ludendorff's realization was grim. He understood that the German army was no longer a cohesive fighting force capable of holding a front. It was a collection of broken men and retreating shadows. The psychological blow was perhaps even greater than the physical one. The Black Day proved that the German military machine, the pride of the Kaiser, had finally reached its breaking point. The momentum had shifted irrevocably. The hunters had become the hunted, and the road to the German border was now wide, blood-stained, and open. September 1918, the Balkan Front and the Middle East. While the German army was reeling from the shock at Amiens, a secondary, equally devastating domino effect was beginning to topple the foundations of the Central Powers. For years, the alliance had been held together by a shared commitment to imperial survival, but as the German front began to buckle, the structural integrity of the entire coalition disintegrated. The Central Powers were not a monolith. They were a fragile web of empires, and that web was being torn apart, one strand at a time. The first thread to snap was Bulgaria. By late September, the Bulgarian army, exhausted by years of fighting on two fronts and crippled by a lack of supplies and manpower, reached its absolute breaking point. The Allied forces, pushing up through the Salonika front, had breached the Macedonian lines. As the Bulgarian soldiers faced the prospect of total annihilation, the government in Sofia realized that continued resistance offered nothing but certain destruction. In a desperate bid for survival, Bulgaria signed the Armistice of Salonika. Their exit was a catastrophe for the Central Powers. It unhinged the entire southern flank, leaving the Ottoman Empire exposed and creating a massive gap in the defensive lines that stretched from the Balkans to the heart of Europe. With Bulgaria gone, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, found itself isolated and bleeding. The Arab Revolt, fueled by British promises and the fervor of nationalist movements, had already turned the desert sands into a graveyard for Ottoman authority. As Allied troops surged through the Levant, the Ottoman leadership realized that the war was no longer a struggle for territory, but a desperate fight for the very existence of their state. Under the crushing weight of British and Arab advances, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros in October. The collapse of the Ottoman front didn't just remove a combatant, it dismantled the gateway to the east, leaving the German and Austro-Hungarian allies virtually alone in a tightening noose. But perhaps the most agonizing collapse was that of Austria-Hungary. Unlike Germany, which remained a centralized power, the dual monarchy was a sprawling, polyglot empire held together by a fraying thread of imperial loyalty. As the German army retreated, the various ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, South Slavs, saw their opportunity. The war had become a catalyst for their own national aspirations. Internal unrest turned into open revolution. The soldiers, many of whom were more loyal to their specific ethnicities than to the Habsburg throne, simply began to desert in droves. By the end of October, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no longer a functioning state. It was a collection of warring factions and emerging nations. The imperial army, once a massive force capable of holding vast stretches of the Eastern and Italian fronts, had effectively ceased to exist as a unified fighting body. The Armistice of Villa Giusti brought an end to their involvement, leaving Germany as the final, lonely bastion of the Central Powers. The collapse was total. The alliance had not just lost battles, it had lost its soul. The geopolitical map of the world was being rewritten in real time, not by the victor's pens, but by the sudden, violent dissolution of the empires that had ignited the fire in 1914. The Central Powers were no longer an empire. They were a memory, waiting for the final silence. November 11, 1918, Compiègne, France. The dominoes had all fallen. From the mountains of the Balkans to the sands of the Levant, the edifice of the Central Powers had crumbled into dust. Now, only Germany remained, a solitary, exhausted giant standing amidst the ruins of its own making. The German High Command, led by Ludendorff and Hindenburg, looked upon a landscape of utter catastrophe. The blockade had starved their cities. The revolution at home had paralyzed their industry, and the arrival of millions of fresh American troops had rendered any hope of a tactical victory impossible. The war was no longer being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought against the inevitable. In a desperate, final attempt to secure a peace that wouldn't result in a total occupation, the German government sought an armistice. They needed a way out that preserved a shred of national dignity, but the Allies had little interest in mercy. To the British, French, and Americans, this was not a negotiation between equals. It was the formal surrender of a defeated aggressor. On November 11, a specialized railway carriage was selected to serve as the setting for this final, grim chapter. It was parked in a quiet clearing in the forest of Compiègne, deep within the French countryside. Inside that carriage, the fate of millions would be decided. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that bordered on the suffocating. On one side of the table sat the Allied Supreme Command, led by the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. On the other sat the German delegates, men who represented a nation currently descending into the chaos of revolution. There was no room for grand diplomatic flourishes or the sweeping rhetoric of the early war years. The terms were clinical, harsh, and uncompromising. Germany was to evacuate all occupied territories immediately. They were to surrender their heavy weaponry, their aircraft, and their entire submarine fleet. Most crucially, they were to accept the responsibility for the devastation they had wrought. As the pen scratched across the parchment, the realization began to sink in. This was not a truce to allow for further maneuvering. It was the end. The German delegation signed, not out of a sense of justice, but out of a crushing necessity to prevent a total collapse into civil war. At 5:00 a.m., the terms were communicated to the front lines. The order was simple: cease all hostilities at 11:00 a.m. For the soldiers in the trenches, the news was met with a surreal, hollow disbelief. For 4 years, the rhythm of their lives had been dictated by the roar of artillery and the whistle of incoming shells. The concept of silence was almost more terrifying than the noise. Men sat in the mud, staring at the gray sky, waiting for a clock to strike a moment that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Then the moment arrived. At the 11th hour of the 11th day, the guns fell silent. In the Western Front, the silence was deafening. It swept across no man's land, rolling over the craters, the tangled barbed wire, and the frozen remains of the fallen. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on the very earth. For the first time since July 1914, the air was still. The Great War was over. The industrial slaughter had ceased. But as the soldiers emerged from their muddy graves into the sudden stillness, they found that, while the fighting had stopped, the world they had known was gone forever. January 18, 1919, Paris, France. The guns had fallen silent, but the peace was far from settled. As the soldiers emerged from the trenches to a world transformed by grief, the architects of the new global order began to gather in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. This was the Paris Peace Conference, a gathering of diplomats, politicians, and monarchs intended to stitch the shattered pieces of Europe back together. But this was no mere meeting of minds. It was a collision of irreconcilable visions, a high-stakes struggle to determine who would hold the reins of power in the wake of the greatest catastrophe in human history. The conference was dominated by a triumvirate known as the Big Four. They were the leaders of the victors, and each arrived with a mandate shaped by the blood spilled in the trenches. First, there was Georges Clemenceau of France. Known as the Tiger, Clemenceau was driven by a singular, visceral necessity: security. France had been the primary battlefield of the war. Its industry was leveled, its youth decimated, and its soil soaked in the blood of a generation. To Clemenceau, Germany was not just a defeated enemy, but a perennial threat that had to be crippled, physically and economically, so that it could never rise again. Then there was David Lloyd George of Great Britain. He occupied a precarious middle ground. While the British public clamored for retribution, Lloyd George understood that a completely destroyed Germany would create a power vacuum in Central Europe and leave the continent vulnerable to the rising tide of Bolshevism from the East. He sought a peace that punished Germany, but one that allowed it to remain a functioning trading partner. Finally, there was Woodrow Wilson of the United States. A man of lofty ideals and academic rigor, Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a blueprint for a new world order based on self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent such a horror from ever recurring. He spoke of peace without victory, a concept that sounded noble in a lecture hall but rang hollow in the halls of Versailles. As the months dragged on, the idealism of Wilson collided violently with the realism of Clemenceau. The atmosphere in Paris was not one of cooperation, but of intense, bitter negotiation. The delegates were not just redrawing borders, they were deciding the fates of millions. They debated the fate of the collapsed Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, carving out new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia from the ruins of the old. But the shadow of the war loomed over every decision. The Allies were haunted by the scale of the loss, and this collective trauma fueled a desire for vengeance that ultimately drowned out the calls for stability. The resulting tension would culminate in a document that was less a bridge to peace and more a sentence of retribution. The conference was tasked with building a new world, but in their desperation to punish the old one, the Big Four were inadvertently sowing the seeds of the next great catastrophe. June 28, 1919, Versailles, France. The atmosphere inside the Hall of Mirrors was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a world demanding justice. For months, the diplomats had argued, postured, and traded concessions, but the final document, the Treaty of Versailles, was now a reality. It was not a treaty born of consensus, but one dictated by the victors. The German delegation, having been excluded from the negotiations entirely, was summoned to the palace only to be presented with a finished ultimatum. They were given no choice but to sign, or face a renewed invasion. To the German people, the treaty was a diktat, a dictated peace, and at its heart lay the most controversial clause of all, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single sentence forced Germany to accept full moral responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. It was more than a legal technicality. It was a profound psychological blow, a national humiliation that struck at the very core of German identity. This admission of guilt served as the legal foundation for the treaty's most crushing demand, reparations. The financial burden placed upon Germany was staggering, a mountain of debt designed to compensate the Allies for their wartime losses. Estimates fluctuated, but the scale was intended to be astronomical, aiming to cripple the German economy for generations. It was a move that satisfied Clemenceau's thirst for retribution, but it ignored the economic reality that a bankrupt Germany would be a destabilized Germany. The treaty also systematically dismantled the German military. To ensure they could never again pose a threat to the peace, the German army was capped at a mere 100,000 men, a skeletal force incapable of modern warfare. They were forbidden from possessing tanks, heavy artillery, or an air force. Their navy was gutted, and the Rhineland, the industrial heartland bordering France, was demilitarized, creating a buffer zone that left Germany feeling perpetually vulnerable and exposed. The map of Europe was being physically rewritten by the ink of this document. Germany was stripped of its overseas colonies, which were redistributed among the victors as mandates. It lost significant territories in Europe. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, and the creation of the Polish Corridor severed East Prussia from the rest of the German state. While these changes were framed under Wilson's principle of self-determination, the reality was often a messy, arbitrary carving of land that left millions of ethnic Germans living as minorities in newly formed, often hostile, neighboring states. As the German representatives signed the document, a sense of dread began to permeate the halls of power. The treaty had achieved its immediate goal. It ended the state of war. But as the ink dried, it became increasingly clear that the peace was built on a foundation of resentment. By punishing Germany so severely, the Allies had not neutralized the threat of future conflict. Instead, they had radicalized a population. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to be the cornerstone of a new era of stability. Instead, it became a symbol of perceived injustice. It created a vacuum of economic despair and political chaos in Central Europe, a vacuum that would eventually be filled by the most radical and destructive forces of the 20th century. The Great War was over, but the peace had merely provided a 20-year intermission before the storm returned. January 1, 1920, Paris, France. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was barely dry, but the old world had already ceased to exist. If Versailles was the hammer that struck Germany, the subsequent redrawing of the global map was the scalpel that dissected the ancient empires of Europe and the Middle East. The Great War had not merely shifted borders, it had annihilated the political structures that had defined human civilization for centuries. The most dramatic transformation occurred in Central and Eastern Europe. The four great empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, had collapsed like houses of cards, leaving a vast, chaotic vacuum. In their wake, the principle of national self-determination, championed by Woodrow Wilson, was used to birth a constellation of new nations. From the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an independent Poland emerged. To the victors, this was the triumph of liberty. To the displaced, it was a chaotic reorganization that often ignored the complex web of ethnic realities on the ground. New borders were drawn with a heavy hand, creating successor states that were often fragile and ethnically fractured. In the rush to create nation-states, millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a line. An ethnic Pole might find himself a citizen of a new state in the Baltics. A German might find his home swallowed by the new Polish corridor. These minority problems became the tinder for future nationalist resentment, as these new borders frequently trapped large populations within hostile jurisdictions, turning the dream of self-determination into a geopolitical nightmare. But the map was being rewritten far beyond the European continent. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire triggered a different, perhaps more enduring tragedy. Through the secretive Sykes-Picot Agreement, Britain and France had acted as the ultimate architects of the region, carving up Ottoman territories into mandates. Lines were drawn through the sands of Mesopotamia, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, lines that cared little for tribal, linguistic, or religious boundaries. These artificial borders were designed to serve imperial interests, securing oil reserves and strategic maritime routes, but they planted the seeds of century-long instability. The Middle East was being restructured not for the benefit of its inhabitants, but to serve the strategic appetites of distant European capitals. Even the Pacific and Africa were not spared this seismic shift. The German colonial empire was dismantled, its territories carved up and distributed among the victors under the guise of League of Nations mandates. This was imperialism by another name, a redistribution of spoils that maintained the global hierarchy while stripping the losers of their reach. As the dust of the Great War settled, the world looked fundamentally different. The map of 1914 was gone, replaced by a patchwork of new states, fragile mandates, and embittered remnants of fallen giants. On paper, the world had been reorganized to prevent the recurrence of such a cataclysm. In reality, the new map was a landscape of tension. The borders were too rigid, the ethnic compositions too volatile, and the imperial legacies too heavy. The diplomats in Paris had succeeded in drawing a new map, but they had failed to ensure that the people living within those lines would ever truly find peace. January 1, 1920, Paris, France. As the dust settled over the newly drawn maps of a fractured world, a new institution was born from the ashes of the Great War. It was an idea born not of cynicism, but of a desperate, almost profound necessity. The world had just witnessed the industrialization of slaughter. The sheer scale of the carnage had convinced the survivors that the old methods of diplomacy, the secret treaties, the shifting alliances, and the balance of power were no longer sufficient to safeguard humanity. The goal was nothing less than the permanent abolition of war. This was the League of Nations. The architect of this grand experiment was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. For Wilson, the League was the centerpiece of his 14 points, a moral crusade to replace the might makes right philosophy of the 19th century with a system of collective security. The concept was revolutionary. If one nation were to commit an act of aggression, the rest of the world would act together to restrain it. It was to be a forum where grievances could be settled through arbitration and law rather than through the mobilization of armies. It was a dream of a global community, governed by reason rather than by the dictates of imperial ambition. But the League was born with a fundamental, crippling paradox. While it was championed by the American president, the United States itself, the world's rising industrial titan, would ultimately refuse to join. A fierce debate in the U.S. Senate over sovereignty and isolationism meant that the very nation that had provided the moral and economic impetus for the League would remain an outsider, a ghost at its own feast. Without American participation, the League lacked the teeth, the economic muscle, and the global reach necessary to truly enforce its mandates. Furthermore, the League was haunted by the specter of the very war it sought to prevent. While its stated mission was peace, its early structure was deeply entangled with the spoils of victory. The mandate system, the process by which former German and Ottoman territories were distributed among the victors, was framed as a way to oversee the development of these regions, but to many, it looked like nothing more than a sophisticated rebranding of imperialism. The League was tasked with maintaining order, yet it was operating within a framework established by the winners of a brutal conflict, often at the expense of the losers and the colonized. The League of Nations was a monumental attempt to institutionalize peace, but it was an institution built on shifting sands. It lacked its own standing army, it struggled with the absence of key global powers, and it was forced to navigate a world still reeling from the trauma of 1914. It was a noble, idealistic endeavor, yet it was also a fragile one. As the 1920s unfolded, the question would remain: could a collection of sovereign states, still driven by national interest and wounded pride, truly surrender their impulse for war to a council of diplomats? Or was the League merely a beautiful, hollow vessel, waiting for the next storm to shatter it? November 11, 1918, Compiègne, France. The silence that fell over the Western Front at the 11th hour was not a celebration. It was a vacuum. It was a sudden, deafening absence of the artillery that had defined life for 4 years. But as the guns fell quiet, a different kind of silence began to settle over the continent. A heavy, hollow stillness that resided not in the trenches, but in the homes and hearts of the survivors. While the diplomats in Paris were busy redrawing borders and debating the fine print of treaties, the true cost of the Great War was being tallied in something far more profound than hectares of territory or gold reserves. The cost was human. It was a cost that could not be measured in maps, but in the empty chairs at dinner tables and the millions of letters that would never be answered. The Great War had done something unprecedented in the history of conflict. It had systematically harvested a generation. Between 1914 and 1918, nearly 10 million soldiers perished. But the statistics fail to capture the sociological catastrophe. In many European nations, the war had effectively hollowed out the demographic core of the young male population. A generation of poets, engineers, fathers, and leaders had been fed into the meat grinder of Verdun and the Somme. What remained was a fractured society, populated by the walking wounded, not just those with missing limbs or blinded eyes, but those whose minds had been permanently shattered by the relentless trauma of industrial slaughter. This was the birth of shell shock. For the first time, the world had to confront the reality of psychological disintegration. Men returned from the front not as conquering heroes, but as shadows of themselves, haunted by the rhythmic thud of heavy artillery, the sight of mustard gas rolling across no man's land, and the unbearable guilt of being the ones who survived while their comrades were swallowed by the mud. The social fabric of Europe was irrevocably torn. The traditional hierarchies of the 19th century, the unquestioned authority of the church, the monarchy, and the military, had been decimated in the trenches. How could a young man return to a world of rigid social etiquette and imperial grandeur after witnessing the absolute, chaotic nihilism of modern warfare? The old world had died in the mud, and the new world was being born into a state of profound disillusionment. This sense of futility birthed a cultural malaise that would define the 1920s. It gave rise to the lost generation, a term famously captured by Hemingway and Remarque to describe those who felt adrift, stripped of the moral certainties that had once guided human existence. They were a people who had seen the pinnacle of human civilization used to facilitate the most efficient mass murder in history. As the League of Nations attempted to build a structure of peace on paper, it ignored the psychological reality beneath it, a continent of widows, orphans, and broken men. The scars of the war were not merely physical, they were spiritual. The Great War had not just ended empires, it had ended an era of innocence. And in the hollow eyes of the survivors, there remained a haunting, unspoken question. If this was the cost of peace, what would be the cost of the next failure? June 28, 1919, Paris, France. If the trenches were where the physical bodies of a generation were lost, then the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was where the political soul of Europe was dismantled. As the Big Four gathered to dictate the terms of peace, they were not merely writing a treaty, they were constructing a monument to resentment. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to be a blueprint for a new world order, but in its pursuit of retribution, it became a blueprint for future conflict. For the Allied powers, particularly France, the goal was clear: security through the systematic crippling of Germany. They demanded massive territorial concessions, the loss of all overseas colonies, and the dismantling of the German military. But the most devastating blow was not territorial but moral. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. To the German people, this was not justice. It was a profound national humiliation that bypassed the complexities of the alliance systems and the Balkan powder keg, placing the entire weight of the catastrophe on a single, wounded nation. This humiliation was compounded by the crushing burden of reparations. The astronomical sums demanded by the victors were designed to prevent German resurgence, but they instead fueled hyperinflation and economic instability. The Weimar Republic, the fledgling democracy born from the ashes of the empire, was shackled to a debt it could never hope to pay. In the bread lines and the darkened streets of Berlin, the treaty was not seen as a peace settlement, but as a diktat, a dictated peace imposed by force. While Germany was being squeezed, the map of the world was being violently redrawn. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires left a vacuum in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. New nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, sprang into existence, carved out of the ruins of old dynasties. But these new borders were often arbitrary, drawn by diplomats in distant rooms who had little regard for the ethnic, linguistic, or religious realities on the ground. These successor states were frequently unstable, containing large, disgruntled minorities that would become the flashpoints for future aggression. In the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the Ottoman territories into British and French mandates, sowing the seeds of instability that would haunt the region for a century. The League of Nations was meant to be the safeguard against such chaos. It was a grand, idealistic experiment designed to replace the old balance of power with collective security. Yet from its inception, the League was crippled. The United States, the very nation that had provided the industrial muscle to tip the scales in 1917, retreated into isolationism, refusing to join the very organization it had helped conceive. Without the weight of the world's rising superpower, the League was a giant without limbs, a moral authority with no teeth. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But as the dust settled over the newly drawn borders and the economic foundations of Europe began to crumble, it became clear that the peace of 1919 was merely a temporary ceasefire. The treaty had not resolved the tensions of nationalism, imperialism, or militarism. It had merely suppressed them, feeding them into a simmering cauldron of bitterness. The architects of Versailles had sought to build a house of peace, but they had unwittingly built a pressure cooker. The seeds of the next war had been sown in the very soil meant to nourish a lasting peace.